What does that mean? Lester looked a little more closely at the edged wood and then back again at Margot. I don't know. She read back over it again carefully. Badly written, whatever it is. Catching just a glimpse of what seemed like the mouse rolling its eyes, he exclaimed, "Hey!" Then upon realizing he was talking to a mouse, he flushed. Do you suppose, Margot still deep in thought, we are the numbers? With this remark, the mouse began jumping up and down, adding a few squeaks to the heavy contemplative mix. The teenagers felt they needed to investigate this furry creature further, and both of them knelt to close the gap between the mouse's size and theirs. Where did you come from, little guy? Margot ventured. There was no time for answers from that which was not speaking, but squeaking, for just then a large growl bellowed out of the darkness that surrounded them, and they conjoined efforts to somehow escape again via the direction they came. The tiny, fat, and yet uncommonly swift mouse leaped in front of them onto the staircase, motioning for them to stop with its two tiny paws out in front. Les and Margot looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed, with the undisclosed source of fear behind them, and a tiny mouse indicating that perhaps all was well. The mouse slowly continued his leadership skills, all without the benefit of words, and motioned them to follow once again. He led them through the dark right toward the eerie noise. In the blackness, the teens could distinguish glistening eyes staring in their direction. They held their breath, but followed their rodent commander obediently. The mouse walked right up to what appeared to be a large dog and swatted it on its nose with a simultaneous squeak. There's something familiar about that, remarked Les. Simultaneously, perhaps, both of the teens realized what they were up against. We're on some kind of a magic ship. Margot was the first to confess the revelation out loud. She knelt down again, now in front of two animals. You're Copper, aren't you? Pointing to the fat mouse, who was now throwing up its tiny arms in victory. Squeak, squeak, came the response. The realization was deepening in Lester's perspective as well, as he bent down to relay his own discovery. The captain set us free, didn't he? He's the bear! More squeaking. That connection had not penetrated Margot's mind, and she let out a gasp in recognition, but further added upon reflection, Lester, he wants to fulfill the prophecy. Both teens sat down in the hall of the great Deborah, the namesake of their mother, with their knees having succumbed to what was now an unavoidable truth. They gazed back at the inscription on the wall, lit by a lamp hanging from the ceiling. It all seemed eerie, exciting, and yet inescapable, which left them wrestling with helplessness once again. What does this prophecy have to do with us? Lester's insides still leaned heavily toward untying the raft and paddling their way toward home. The little rodent let out an albeit tiny, exasperated yelp, throwing in a tiny eye roll for good measure. Hey, Lester reprimanded, you might be cute and furry now, but I still don't like you, and now you are way smaller than me. Another miniature eye roll. Perhaps we should wait until morning, Les. Margot didn't like to see her brother struggle so much with his loss of control, stripped of every method he possessed to protect her. The teenagers were overcome with tiredness as they sat in the bottom of the ship, illumined solely by one lamp hanging from the ceiling, enshrining the inscription on the wall that seemed to hold their fate. The mouse pulled out some blankets from a deep corner somewhere, not without a lot of effort, and the large wolf-like dog licked its paws, yawned a great yawn, and nestled itself into a ball. Then slowly, with the waves rocking them to sleep, and the sounds of the timbers creaking their song, the teenagers drifted off farther than the ship was taking them once again. If the first time Margot was awakened that night was rude, the second time was a shot out of the proverbial park altogether. By degrees, more animals, including the snake, encompassed the teens as they slept, curling up beside them or sprawling out as the need arose. All went swimmingly as far as sound sleeping goes, until just before dawn Margot felt herself once again being pulled out of her dream. But it was literal this time, pulled up the stairs in an array of thumps and scratches. Her screams alerted the rest of the crew, comprised of different land creatures, all sleepily trying to discern what was taking place. Alarm and horror marked their faces, albeit mostly furry ones, and the mouse dashed forward to try to assist, with the rest close behind. Margot was puzzled by Copper's alarm. Yes, she had screamed, but in the back of her mind this was a reprisal of the earlier episode, which had left them without bodily harm, a good night's sleep and plenty of food to boot. She had only perused the ground she was being pulled away from, and not the face that was taking her to a new destination. She looked up. The sight was grueling. These were not the friendly animals that had been keeping her and her brother warm. These were horrid and distorted monsters. All was suddenly a blur, as the intensity of the moment rendered her almost useless in trying to pull away. Her brother had grabbed the closest thing he could find in a frenzy of desire, but lacking some forethought, threw it in the direction of her captors. It was the lamp that caught the blow. It was rashly bashed against the wall by one perpetrator, and they now had no light, just a fire to put out. Up out of the hold, Margot was rudely recruited, only to meet a very angry version of the bear that had untied their ropes. He was not pleased with the current circumstances and attempted to fight all of them off, which seemed numberless. Some seemed to crawl straight out of the water through the floorboards of the ship. The man-like horrible creature that had Margot bound said nothing to her as he pulled her toward the side of the Deborah. This was looking more and more like the end, even as the sun was beginning to rise under the dark clouds that came with the strange creatures. Slammed against the railing, the captive peered into the bear's eyes, searching for some kind of assurance. To her surprise, despite the steep battle he was in, a combat he was equally winning and losing, he looked straight at her as if he was expecting something spectacular from her small frame and weak arms. "Say!" Then more growling. "What?" What he was getting at completely escaped her right at this intense moment, but the bear captain was saying it with a lot of gusto. The tiny mouse, with all of his non-existent might, was trying to block her way off the ship and procured a spot next to her, close enough to peer into her eyes as well. "Say squeak!" Desperation filled the brown little globes as he tried to communicate to her through them. A large wail of a growl flew from the bear's guts that was somehow less hairy than before. "Grr, say it!" Margot was now holding onto the railing, only on the outside of the ship, in a last-ditch effort to circumvent the inevitable, kicking as she went. "Say his name!" the mouse finally squeaked with comprehensible words, who was growing taller by the second. "Whose name?" Margot cried desperately, while her brother grabbed her hand from the other side of the railing. He had suffered himself, but battle-wounded nevertheless, was ready to be kidnapped with her if necessary. The bear lurched forward with a final punch at some dark foe off to the side. "Your Daz!" "Stephen?" Confirmed by the eyes of Copper quickly changing back to himself, Margot shouted, "Stephen Clay Honor!" All suddenly went calm. The black clouds that had covered the Deborah completely disappeared. It revealed the morning sun in all its glory, and some other things, perhaps not G-rated. "Marg, cover your eyes." Her brother heaved a sigh of relief and offered this suggestion, pulling her up onto the deck. "We'll be back in a jiffy," squeaked Copper as he disappeared out of sight. "You all right?" Margot was never so glad to call Lester her brother. Margot looked behind her into the waters that had disclosed these horrors. It was like she was beholding some kind of a deep well, a strange watery spiral sweeping down just below the surface, a circular whirl. It recalled the perpetrators back into its pit from which they apparently emerged. It now swept them away fearfully close to the victims, who were standing peering down into the mysterious chasm. Finally, the waves closed up, and the source of their horrors disappeared altogether. The bear, or captain now, stood above her, thankfully dressed, and looked down into the same mystery. He seemed not to be surprised, though, and also seemed to know her thoughts. "We are lucky a whole dark island didn't come up and knock this ship sideways." "Whole islands can emerge from down there?" This was perplexing, to say the least. In a moment, for the first time since meeting, Baird, the fierce, strong captain, looked like he might shiver with fright. Les asked what they both had wanted to ask. "Where are we?" "Let's just say," the captain lowered his tone to reassure he was heard, "you would not have been able to paddle back to Seattle." He smiled widely and laughed heartily at his comical thought, fancying himself quite clever. Margot was still glued to the complexities below. "Whole islands?" she repeated. "Aye, the Dark Isles," Byron returned. "They've grown in number and in strength. Perhaps the old man of the shadows thinks he's too strong to send in a real battle. Ha!" "What does he want with me?" Margot wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer to this. It was delivered timidly. "Look around you." The captain motioned for her to peruse the seamen that were emerging from below deck. See anything missing? See anything peculiar? Margot wasn't sure how honest she should be, but gave him a look that betrayed her thoughts. The captain swung back on his heels in the loudest roar of laughter that summoned all the seamen to join in, whether or not they knew what was so comical. "Aye," reassured Byron, "it's a lot to take in, I'll wager," still snickering. Copper emerged from the hole, grabbed young Les by the arm, and gathered Margot close by to peer into the sky. "See anything missing there?" Both of the teens paused for a moment, looked at each other over the top of Copper's head, and then continued their perusal of the sky. Slowly, Les offered a suggestion. "No clouds?" Indeed strange for the two hailing from Seattle, Washington. "Nope." Copper was sadly peering into the vastness, as if what was missing affected his inmost being. Margot gasped, recognizing the absence of the prominent seaside pest. "No birds!" Copper looked squarely into her eyes with tears in his. "No women either." "That does not seem likely," came Les's retort. "How did you get here, or any of you, without women?" "No children either." Copper looked sideways at Lester. "What do birds have to do with women?" Not grasping any of this, Margot attempted clarity, but was quickly interrupted. "Oh no, Copper, there'll be one child left." Byron was now pacing a bit, as if planning his next move or a comical comeback. "Aye, Captain, but when the old man grabs her, time will soon be running out, won't it, sir?" "Aye, Copper, aye." Both were brooding over events and prophecies, unaware of the baffled teenagers standing before them. "But what does this have to do with birds? Or me?" Perhaps Margot knew why she was the intended target before, but was now not altogether certain of her place in this whole set of circumstances, or this new world. "Our women are his birds," Copper relented. He shook his head and added further, "We will soon be critters forever. They birds, separated for always." "Where are they?" Les asked timidly. "Captured." "Okay," Les returned. "But where?" "Someplace from whence those hooligans come, I reckon." Copper peered down into the clear waters, upon one of those moving black isles. "We'll get 'em, Copper." Byron weighed in with responsive compassion. "For sure we'll get 'em now." "I sure hope so, Cap." Margot entered with a point of discussion that had been brewing since the day before, at the point of kidnap. "Okay, so now I may understand why we were kidnapped, but why us? Me and Les." "You're Stevens' kids," the captain beamed. Margot stopped for a moment, but now it was Les's turn for the ground to erupt under his feet. Wasn't he dead? She cautiously let out a response. "Is he here?" "I should jolly well think so," said the captain, almost yelling with apparent glee the thought offered him. Switching to repose quite suddenly, he continued, "Somewhere." Les did not know whether to be furious or excited. "What? I mean, how do we find him?" "You don't." The captain was still smiling. "He finds you." This was all too much to take in. Both Margot and Les sat right where they had been standing. Copper found an empty space between them, per usual, and commenced to reassure them that what they were feeling was totally acceptable. Les sort of glanced at him sideways, but Margot perused his face for more answers. "It's all right, kids. I am sure you're quite shocked about it all," but he was not able to finish. "To say the least," Les responded, but couldn't bring himself to add another word and sunk back. "Where is he, Copper?" Margot pleaded. "I don't rightly know," offered Copper, "but I can imagine we'll see him quick enough." "Why would he come here?" Now the words pressed against Lester's lips like a dam overfilled. "And leave us!" No, Copper returned with his characteristic warmth. "It's not like that at all." After a moment he continued, "You see, your dad came to the water's edge many a time, just like you, in a heap of pain about your ma. Then by and by had to deal with the man of the shadows." "And?" Margot looked at Copper for a little more clarity than what this synopsis was providing. "He forgot who he was." Copper looked listlessly in front of him. "What? He's our dad!" Margot now took on full complaining stance. "Oh, my dear." Copper attempted to soften the mood. "He's also a prince." With that came a glistening in the short seaman's eyes. "A prince?" Both Margot and Lester responded with due emotional outcome. Byron abruptly interrupted the conversation. "Listen, lads and lass. We will surely come upon real trouble soon, and must prepare ourselves. He tossed the sword in Lester's direction, starting with you, young man. What do I do? Margot seemed motivated by some new and strange force of encouragement. Stay out of sight, Baron exhorted roughly, but remember what to do if you get caught. That was a disappointing request, but still this newfound information that implied that she might see her dad once more was flooding within a large well by which to live and hope off of. Isn't it too good to be true, she thought. She worried that her brother would disregard it. She feared that he would get colder and more bitter instead. Les? Slowly approaching the subject. Yeah? He looked as inquisitively at her face as she had when she wondered what the bear was trying to growl at her during the fight. It was her turn to ask, You all right? He shrugged, but his eyes looked lost. On your feet, boy, Byron smiled as he stretched his sword in Lester's direction. The struggle on Lester's face was apparent as he tried to grasp what Byron had in mind with the tip of his sword practically up his nose. Time to learn to fight. Oh, nah, Lester replied. I'm a pacifist. Your very breath is a fight, my friend, Byron smiled. Might as well engage in the battle and enjoy great rewards. How can I think of battles when Lester dropped off in a painful intensity. If he had said what he was thinking, he felt he might not be justified in the pain or the anger he was experiencing. Sure, Byron leaned down to reassure the young man. We must learn to fight through the pain, or rather, in spite of it. What an impossibility it seemed to Lester as he just stared at Byron for a moment. He wasn't sure if he should tell him off for suggesting such a thing or laugh in disdain. There was no way he could look past the pain of losing his dad, and now with this kind of new revelation about him, be compelled to embrace it. On your feet, the tall captain urged further, and he didn't look like he was going to take no for an answer. Lester complied slowly. Margot cautiously watched her brother stumble around with a sword that seemed too large and heavy for him. He half-heartedly assumed every position that the captain commanded. The other seamen went about doing their daily tasks, and Copper adjusted Lester's poses at needed intervals. The sky was clear like glass. The waves were quietly brushing the sides of the gallant ship. Then, "Ahoy!" interrupted everyone's thoughts from up in the crow's nest. "Land ho!" another interjection from way up in the ship's basket. All hands were on deck in a moment, peering over the sides of the railings. They clambered over one another, repeating their questions that none seemed to know the answer to. "What's that? Which land is it?" Byron let out a low rumble of a response at the discovery. "By Jove! What is it, Cap?" Copper ran around the captain's feet like a terrier. "It looks as though we've come up on Jade, me good fellow." Lester furrowed his eyebrows. "But it's not certain?" "We'll soon see." Byron's eyes were still locked toward the direction of the mysterious place. "Don't you have a map?" Lester further questioned. Both Copper and Byron now snapped their focus in Lester's direction, along with a few hands, as it were. A roar of laughter lifted out from the lot. "Map?" Copper noted, grinning from ear to ear. "He's a funny one, that one. No, my boy. We don't make our way around with our eyes or know how." Byron smiled, this time with warmth. "We make our way beyond without sight." "Then how? What?" If there had been any sense of logic in this expedition, it was now crumbled in a pile at Lester's feet. So, Margot thought she might try to get to the bottom of these endeavors. "You just sail around endlessly?" "Good Jacob," he laughed. "No," Byron stomped his foot in retort. "There's a plan at work at Jade for sure." Copper resumed his gaze in the direction of the not-too-far-off mass of land. "Like what?" Margot continued to question. "Will my dad be there?" "We know not where your dad be, but we do knows one thing for sure." Byron gathered up his sword, adjusted his cap, walked toward the bow to assume his leadership role, now yelling, "There's a lesson there, you gents, and a fight for victory!" Lester now cupped his head in his hands. Surely the captain didn't mean for him to fight. "Take up your sword, boy," Copper said, totally unaware he had just read Lester's thoughts. "But I want to find our dad!" Margaret almost cried at what was surely a pointless upheaval to her plans. "We must go the course," Byron yelled over the seas and toward everyone on ship. Suddenly it looked like everyone was preparing for all-out war, yelling, jeering, and rallying themselves into an all-out frenzy. The ship anchored aloof from the shores of what was presumed to be Jade. and all the inhabitants of the Deborah piled into a dinghy one after another. Byron had to be argued with a bit concerning his allowance toward Margot and her attendance on one of these canoes. He relented when Copper reminded him that something could happen to her while they were gone. There was really no real safety in that way anywhere. So what are we going to do? Lester embarked upon the looming subject at hand with reproach, as much as he could muster. Investigate, me boy, Byron roared. He was enjoying the whole thing far too much. Margot and Lester looked at each other in total exasperation. Do we know anything about this place? Margot continued the conversation carried out seemingly in vain. Large creatures, volcanoes, and undoubtedly treasure. Copper was sitting next to Margot and replied quietly as he did not want to interrupt his master's euphoric display. Any people? Lester was hoping this meant there wasn't going to be any battles per se that included sword fighting. Not sure if there's any left. Copper dropped off in an almost shudder. Byron looked down at his small crew in the dinghy. Find what's left of the men, me hearties. Upon the sand they scuttled up, dragging their soaked nether regions with them. They rose up onto the embankment like gleaming cohorts, though all the shimmering came from being drenched in seawater. Byron, ever the fearless leader, went before them, motioning them to keep behind. With sword in hand, he crept up toward the foliage that lined the beach. Suddenly, there was a loud roar, not of the laughter the teens had grown accustomed to on the Deborah. This was an animal of some kind, though nothing Lester and Margot had ever heard on TV or otherwise. Aye, Byron broke into the alarm they were all experiencing with low tone. "'Tis Jade, me hearties." Curiously, Byron did not head straight into the foliage, but followed the green line farther down the shore, apparently looking for something, still waving for them to follow. "What is he doing?" Lester whispered his question to Copper. "Looking for a trail," he replied steadily. "Of what?" "There is always a trail, dear lad, though perhaps there's barely one left now." Copper again looked suddenly sad. "Aha!" bellowed the captain. The captain was overjoyed by his new discovery. A small, barely visible line that made its way from the yellow sand to the center of who knew where, but unabated by the mystery, Byron beckoned all to follow him into the jungle, awful roars besides. "I'm not sure—" Lester was about to become sensible again. "Shh!" The captain swung around on his leathery heels. "We are here for one reason only, me lad. Trust it." His warning look dulled further inquest. This island had all the makings of a Far East jungle. Margot half expected to see a herd of elephants trampling through the large vines and coconut trees. At this juncture, anything to block out the eerie sounds coming from the foreboding animals would have been welcome. Lester echoed her thoughts. "Wonder if Mowgli lives here," he whispered under his breath. Margot rolled her eyes, and her given perusal of the sky above revealed a frightening sight. Overwhelming the crew below it stood a pair of brontosauruses, happily chewing whatever they had acquired from above their heads. Margot screamed, and the crew jolted to a stop. All she could do was point. The crew gazed above, but not with nearly the same alarm as Margot. "Ye gads," Copper remarked. Byron, after casting a look upward, procured another weapon from his belt and bellowed that the crew continue marching forward. Margot and Lester held hands. They marched further in and further away from the relative safety of the Deborah. It was curious, considering the morning's events, how all seemed better aboard the ship. Relativity always seems more concrete faced with the unknown. This is the crux of adventure. What is to gain by leaving the known? Is it worth it? Few ever find out.